Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Becky and I like to read. Today's video is another recommendation collaboration with a few of my fellow booktubers, and today we will all be dropping videos recommending books with winter or cold settings because it is getting that time of the year in the northern hemisphere anyway, where it's starting to get cold outside. So if you ever need a book recommendation for a readathon or a reading challenge that is set in a cold place, you might be able to reference any of our videos. All of the collaborators on this recommendation video read a variety of different books, so if you don't see something in my video that catches your eye, be sure to go check out their channels and see if there is something in their recommendations that appeal to you as well. And I will have all of their channels tagged down below as well as their individual recommendation videos. But before I get into my recommendations, let me don my Santa hat for the day. As you can probably tell, I am going with a coldish look with the blues and the whites. So let's continue that with the Santa hat of the day. This is another super long Santa hat. The first book I want to recommend to you is a middle grade book, and that is The Forgotten Girl. This is about two best friends who, when it starts snowing one day, their parents call them in, but she loves the snow. She wants to go and play in the snow. So she sneaks out of her bedroom and she ends up stumbling across this grave in the snow, and so that leads her to trying to figure out whose grave this is, and she gets haunted by the ghost of this person's grave, and it leads her to realizing that this is the grave in a segregated cemetery, and it belonged to a little black girl who was a very prominent figure in her community's history, but she's been forgotten, hence the title. So it's just her story of figuring out who this little girl is and giving her the recognition she deserves. I really enjoyed this book. The next book I want to recommend to you is an upper young adult book. It is the second in a series, but I do want to recommend it because it does have a very cold setting, and that is The Silvered Serpents. This is book 2 in the Gilded Wolves series, which is a young adult historical fantasy series about this man named Severin who is trying to find the key to unlocking his magical inheritance, and his friends help him along the way. This book, I believe, is set in Russia in an ice palace. That is where the majority of this book takes place, and it gave me chills reading it just because it was described so cold, and this ice palace, while it's beautiful, it's just so icy. And Roshani Chokshi does a great job of describing things. So this one definitely gave me the wintry, chilly, cold, freezing atmosphere that this recommendation video requires. This next book I'm going to recommend is actually a dystopian and is called The Wolves of Winter. I really enjoyed this story. It is a dystopian set in the Canadian wilderness after the aftermaths of a nuclear war, and it follows our main character, who is a woman who is just trying to survive in the wilderness, and she comes across these people in the Canadian wilderness who have sort of like this compound, and she joins them and they're just trying to survive. I liked this one because it had a lot of action and it had a female main character who knew how to survive. She was a kick-ass character. I also liked the family dynamics, the found family aspect of this story as well. It does have very low romance, so if that's something that you don't like in books, definitely check this out, but it is very wintry. The next recommendation is actually an entire series, and it is a dragon shifter paranormal romance series called The Legends of the Storm by Beck McMaster. Here is the first book, Heart of Fire. This is about dragon shifters who live in Iceland. I wouldn't say it's totally fantasy romance because it does take place in Iceland. You can go to Iceland, but it does have that fantastical element of a dragon society with outcasts within the royal family, and there's court politics involved in it, but each book follows a different member of the dragon family and them finding their mates. But it does take place in Iceland, and Iceland is a cold place, especially in the winter where this book takes place. Our main female character's sheep has just been stolen by this Dreki, and that's her meal source for the winter. So she goes to confront this beast, and she ends up forming a relationship with him. I absolutely love this series. I think I just have one more book to read in it, but I loved all of this series. So if you like dragon shifters, if you like cold settings, I highly recommend you check this one out. The next recommendation is also another series, although I have only read one book in this series, and that is the Ice Planet Barbarian series. I got sucked into the hype of this series because everybody was just blown away with how like kinky and steamy it was. I did not end up loving this series as much as everybody else. I only gave this first book 3 stars. It was pretty tame in my opinion. If these people were humans, this would have been a very vanilla, bland story. But because they're aliens and they have some fun anatomy, everybody hyped it up to be steamier than it was in my opinion. However, it fits with this recommendation because it is set on an ice planet where these women crash land after having been abducted by these bad aliens, and they're trying to survive on this ice planet. So one of them sets out to try and find help, where she ends up meeting one of the blue aliens and they end up forming a romance together. I have not continued in this series because it just wasn't my jam, but it does fit this recommendation and I wanted to slide it in here. The next few books I am going to recommend are all fantasy romance, and the very first one is Guild. So this doesn't entirely take place in a cold setting, but this book I would say the vast majority of it does. This is about a girl named Auren who has been gold touched by Midas, and she is kept in this cage as his pet and plaything pretty much. When she's inside, she looks up at the skylights and she sees the snow falling down, but she never gets to experience it until one day she gets to go on a journey to a different kingdom and she finally gets to experience the outdoors. But it's still very much a cold, wintry atmosphere for the majority of this book. I absolutely love this series. I devoured it. The next fantasy romance is a pretty obvious one, but that is A Court of Frost and Starlight. So this is the novella in the ACOTAR series. It comes after book 3, A Court of Wings and Ruin. And I know a lot of people don't particularly like this novella because nothing much happens in it. There's not really any plot. But I love these characters, and I love seeing my favorite characters in slice of life situations where they're not constantly in danger, they're not constantly fighting for something, they're just enjoying life. And that is what this book gave me. It is set around the winter solstice where they are all trying to find gifts for one another, set in the night court where it is very wintry, obviously. So I had to throw this one in here. The last fantasy romance I want to recommend is Ledge. I did a whole in-depth 6-star review on this book, which I will link down in the description if you want to hear my thoughts on it and why I loved it so much. I am still waiting for my special edition to get here, which will not get here until after Christmas probably. But this is one of my favorite books of the year. This is the story of a girl who has grown up on this very wintry, icy ledge prison. And every now and then, these people called the Glacians come and they pluck a few humans off of this ledge and make them be a human sacrifice. But this girl, she doesn't want to be a human sacrifice. So when she is plucked from this ledge, she instead chooses the option of pretty much being prey. They tell her if she can make it down this wintry mountainside and make it to the human lands, she will be free. And it is quite the journey for her. This book sucked me in. I liked the action. It has a badass axe-wielding main female character. It's got a winged love interest. It did give me some ACOTAR vibes, but I think it stands wholly on its own as a very original story. There is a slow burn romance, and it takes a really long time to get to any steamy scenes, which aren't that steamy. I would say only 2 chili peppers. But I highly recommend it, and it does take place in a very cold setting. So the next book I want to recommend to you isn't entirely set in a cold setting, but parts of it are, and that is Satan. So this is set around Christmas, which Christmas, for me at least, tends to be cold, and our main characters travel to the North Pole, where it is obviously cold. This is a monster romance, obviously, about Satan, who gets summoned accidentally when our female main character writes a letter intended for Santa. It is a hilarious and ridiculous romance that I think you should read this holiday season if you like monster romance. So those are the 9 books that I recommend with cold or winter settings. Be sure to check out my fellow collaborators who are all tagged and linked down below. So until my next video, thank you so much for watching. Stay warm, but read a book with a cold setting for me. Bye.